Well, welcome. I hope you all had a chance to get some food, had lunch. My name's Dave Rajewski, and I direct the Science and Technology Innovation Program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I want to welcome you today to a presentation of a report that was put out, actually, London School of Economics on transnational governance of synthetic biology. The report was actually put out almost a year ago, and we've been trying to get somebody to come over and talk about it, and we got lucky. Claire Maris came over, actually flew in last night, and is leaving later today. So this is thanks to caffeine and her goodwill, we're going to actually be able to finally get the report presented here in Washington. How many actually read this report? People have actually looked at it? We have a few. Okay. I think when it came out, I went back and reread it, and I found it to be a really fascinating report because it deals with synthetic biology and governance, and it wasn't the typical report that simply went through all of the regulations and pieces of legislation and asked the question, will these work? I think the report is basically an incredibly interesting look at synthetic biology as a science and technology embedded in social systems. And it may be a function of who did it. Claire was trained in biology and molecular plant biology, but then went on to do work in science policy and has done a lot of work on risk perception. She's now a senior research fellow at King's College, and I guess that's where the group has kind of migrated along with Nicholas Rose. Nick, I think, started in biology and went to sociology. Is that right?
Yeah, psychology.
Psychology and sociology. So it's an interesting mix of people that did this. I think the other thing that was interesting for me in the report is the word art in the title, which had a tentative set of quotes around it, which have now been removed, I see. I think using the word art in relationship to governance is quite interesting. It's not something that appears much in this country. People sometimes will talk about craft. I was at a meeting yesterday where people were talking about 21st century statecraft as a new approach to public diplomacy. And people in the intelligence community often talk about tradecraft. But I think it's really interesting to actually think about governance as a form of craft or art. So I hope that'll be something we could talk a little bit about. So the choice of word was extremely interesting in terms of what is signified as a governance approach. So Claire, I'm going to turn over to Claire. Claire's going to go through a set of slides, probably 30 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll just open it up for questions and answers. And also, I'd just be interesting to talk kind of your sort of the response you got to this report. It'd be interesting to actually hear, since it's been out for a while, what the reactions were over the course of a year. So, Claire?
Okay. Thank you, David. I'm very pleased to be here. I think it shows that perseverance pays off. The team here was very insistent and trying to make at least one of us come to speak. And we're very pleased to be here. It's not that we didn't want to come, but as David sort of intimated, in this period we've actually moved from institutions, from the London School of Economics to King's College London. And if any of you have moved institutions, you'll know that always takes a lot longer than you thought and a lot more energy than you thought it was going to take. So we moved in January, which is why this slide doesn't mention the London School of Economics, which is where the report came out from. But what was the Bias Centre at the London School of Economics is now the research arm of a new department at King's College London called Social Science, Health and Medicine, which over time is going to become a very big department in this field and is led by Nicholas Rose, who was the director of the Bias Centre. So it's the same team. We've just moved institutions and we're building something which we hope is going to be a lot bigger and a lot more exciting over time. So I work in this department at King's College, but within that department, I'm responsible for the work that we do in collaboration with Imperial College in this partnership, which is the Centre for Synthetic Biology and Innovation, which is a joint centre initially set up between Imperial College and the London School of Economics, now Imperial College and King's College. Where obviously the laboratories and the synthetic biologists who do bench work and both dry and wet work are based at Imperial College, and we do social science work on synthetic biology in collaboration with them. And we might talk more later about what these kinds of partnerships can do, but one of the things they can do is lead to this kind of report that I'll be talking about today. And the centre, interestingly, is funded by the UK Engineering and Physical Research Council, which funds public sector funding for engineering and physical sciences. But it also, in this case, funds the social science that we do. And here you can see we've got about £5 million initially to run the centre for 5 years. We've just heard there's going to be at least another 5 or 7 million coming to continue this work. So I'm going to talk about this report, which you should have had copies of if you can. It's also downloadable from our website. And I want to acknowledge the work of my co-authors, Joy Zhang and Nicholas Rose, with this. Joy did most of the work, I must say, and is also the person who must be acknowledged for having come up with the concept of art. And the word art was very much her idea, because as well as being a very brilliant young sociologist who just finished her PhD, before doing this, she is a budding artist and photographer and has a big interest in art and partly looking at literature on the statecraft in governance. She came up with this idea that art was an interesting thing to look at when looking at governance. So what we did, the report we did was commissioned by the Royal Society, which is our equivalent of your National Academy of Sciences. And when we were asked to do it, the first thing we did was to see what else was around. And there had already been approximately 40 reports in the English language alone on the sort of ethical, legal, and social issues of synthetic biology. That's just about half of them on this slide. And within the previous 3 years, there'd been 28 reports, the period sort of 2008 to 2011. So we thought, what can we do that's going to be different and it's going to build on this work? We don't want to just summarise what's in these reports. We want to try and build on it and do something a bit different. And what we did was that we actually read all these reports. We're probably one of the few people who have read all of these reports, and tried to sort of analyse them in a more sort of cross-cutting way, trying to see what these reports tell us about synthetic biology. How can we use these reports to understand what the sort of root causes for the concerns about synthetic biology, and in a sense, sort of why are people talking so much about it, and try to come up with some recommendations and thoughts about governance at a sort of more overarching level. And that's maybe partly also because we're sociologists, and that's the kind of thing we do. But, and then while we were writing our report, this is the US Presidential Commission report came out, which has probably been one of the most visible and talked about and influential reports of all of these. And of course, just 2 weeks ago, the most recent report came out. This declaration by 111, or I believe now 113 civil society organisations with their own propositions and recommendations about governance. And I'm very pleased that we've got two of the main coordinators for this report in the room today, so we hopefully in the discussion we can talk about what they're proposing, how that fits in with the kind of things I'll be talking about today. So looking at these 40 or so reports, we identified sort of three things that came out of them. One is that there's conflicting narratives that coexist. The second is that most of these reports overlook what we call the trans-scientific nature of science and synthetic biology. And the third is that they engage in speculative ethics. And I must say, for those of you who've read the report, we don't talk about speculative ethics so much in the report. It was more sort of background motivation to what we did, but I've decided to talk about it today in partly in response to what David was saying, sort of what's happened to the report since. And I'll explain maybe later. I think partly because we don't engage in speculative ethics in the same way as all these other reports did, our report maybe hasn't been picked up as much as I would have liked, but we can talk about that. So I'll just go through those different features one by one. First is that conflicting narratives coexist, and I must insist, I do not mean that there are some groups out there who support synthetic biology and want it to be developed and have got one narrative, and other groups out there who oppose it and want it stopped and have a different narrative. What you find is conflicting narratives within the same reports by the same people, often within the same paragraph, or more commonly in different chapters dealing with different topics. So when they're talking about finances compared to when they're talking about ethics or regulations, you'll get different narratives. So the first one, probably very familiar to anybody who's looked at these reports, is that you've got this floating discourse about whether this is new and therefore risky, whether synthetic biology presents us with a new paradigm shift in science and technology, which is going to therefore be the basis for an industrial revolution and be able to solve a lot of problems. and therefore perhaps present new risk, or is it old and familiar and just the same as previous biotechnologies? And as I say, it's not that some actors say one thing and others say the opposite. What you'll get typically is in the discussions about economic promise or patentability, or when scientists are talking to funders, they will stress the newness and potential and paradigm-shifting sense of these technologies. But as soon as we're talking about regulation or communicating with lay publics, we'll tend to talk more about how old it is and how familiar and how much just in continuity with biotechnology going all the way back to making bread and brewing beer. So at the same time, so we're told that synthetic biology is new, presents new risks, and therefore fundamental challenges to the current regulatory framework. And yet at the same time, we're told that maybe those challenges can be met by just borrowing regulations from existing frameworks, such as GMOs or stem cells or nanotechnology or chemicals. And in the end, there seems to be a conclusion that actually the existing regulatory framework works fine. So while the novelty and revolutionary nature of synthetic biology is emphasized in some contexts and seems to imply that something needs to be done, when examination of the regulatory agenda becomes more specific, there always seems to be arguments that nothing else needs to be added. And this is what we're calling here the regulatory paradox. The second feature here is about the economic promise and economic doldrums. This is maybe perhaps more of a UK phenomenon or European phenomenon compared to what you might be more familiar with here. And I should have stressed about a quarter of those English language reports come out of the UK alone, which is also quite an interesting phenomenon. So within Europe and within the UK, there's a discourse that synthetic biology is portrayed as a foundation for the new industrial revolution. It's going to provide us with an unrivaled set of technological solutions for global challenges in health, in agriculture, and in energy production. And yet, on the other hand, the market prospect actually looks quite bleak. So apart from a few corporate oil giants funding work in biofuels, pharmaceutical firms and traditional biotech firms don't actually seem to be investing very much. They seem more reluctant, and I say in the UK at least. And it's argued that government backing is essential in order to provide funding for the foundational tools and the platforms which are going to be necessary before the industry can actually come in to fund their own work. So, and there's a lot of talk in the UK about sort of translational valley of death phenomenons that when industry needs to be basically pumped with money from government in order to invest in this field. So on the one hand, it's got this enormous promise, but on the other hand, government needs to put a lot of money in before private firms will show any interest. The third phenomenon that we see is a sort of conflicting narrative. It says a lot of talk and recommendations about the need for new forms of bottom-up, more participative governance with civil society groups and lay publics involved and public engagement and public dialogue. And yet, when it comes to specific recommendations amidst these propositions, most recommendations go back to actually expecting a strong government role from the government in a top-down kind of traditional way. Okay. And again, I must stress that these are arguments you find in all the reports from the same people. The trans-scientific nature of synthetic biology and most emerging technology, and in fact most science and technology, you can see it if you look at the structure of a lot of these reports. They'll start off by introducing the technology aspects. So what is synthetic biology? What other technologies does it borrow from to do what it does? So a whole set of applications and promises, which, as I say, often quite extraordinary. And then a chapter on regulatory and legal issues, things like biosecurity, biosafety, and intellectual property rights will be discussed. And then there'll be a chapter about sort of less tangible ethical and social issues like, are we playing God? Is it right to play God? What is life? Are we creating life? Does it matter if we create life? And then they will finish off with some call for public involvement. And also, and again, this is partly a UK phenomenon, call for the involvement of social scientists and ethicists. And that's partly why I'm employed in the centre and why I'm here today. So the assumption is that science and technology comes first. You need to in order to define the problem, you have to first talk about what the science and technology is. And then the ethical, social, and legal issues somehow come after, and they're separate, and they're downstream, and they can be dealt with separately from the science and technology, which is just sort of black boxed. That's what it is, and we don't need to discuss that, we just need to discuss what the implications of that is. But we would argue that the political and cultural and economic dimensions are completely embedded and entangled within the science and technology aspects, and hopefully some of that will become clearer as I go on. So, and the third aspect is that many of most of these reports and discussions about synthetic biology engage in what I'm calling here speculative ethics, which is a term that was actually first proposed by a philosopher, Alfred Norman, in the context of debates on nanotechnology. And an article I cited there that I highly recommend. It's very small, but I guess if you look on the web, you'll see the reference. So if you look at the vision of the report, of synthetic biology in these reports, you find that synthetic biology will produce a registry of standardized modular biological parts with well-defined functions. It will develop modeling methods and computer-aided tools which will enable people to use their computer to design living organisms that perform human-defined functions. And thirdly, it will provide access to these registries and these CAD tools in some kind of open source way. So if you take all of that for granted, then you say, wow, that's so powerful and so open that we really must be worried about evil terrorists who are going to get hold of this powerful technology. And all these naive or unregulated DIY bio people who are doing it in their garage or their kitchen. And that's the biggest question we have to do. And I must admit this is a very US phenomenon as well, and most of the US reports focus on this again and again and again. But there's another way of looking at exactly the same story, which is this way. Just like, if synthetic biology succeeds in producing a registry of standardized parts which work in a modular way, where you can actually characterize their function in a very well, in a predictable way that you can exchange with your colleagues all around the world. And if synthetic biology succeeds in developing the modeling tools and the CAD tools which perform design functions, and that these organisms will work in complex environments outside of the laboratory, whether that be in factories or out in the environment. So is my voice not carrying? Yeah, thanks. Is that good? You can hear me? Yeah. And if these standardized biological parts and the knowledge and methods necessary to assemble them are made freely available for every course, then maybe we should think about terrorists. And those ifs are big ifs. They're very big ifs. And so I just don't think we should start the discussion by assuming that all of those things are going to happen and then think about what the implications are. And that's what a lot of the reports do. They just take for granted that this is going to happen. So we have to talk about the implications of that. So if, then we focus on the power and pervasiveness of synthetic biology. We focus on dual use and how do we identify these bad people who are going to misuse the technology. We focus on so-called philosophical questions such as, do we have the right to play God? And on these fantastic promises that it's going to solve all these global challenges in the energy sector, the health sector, or the food and agricultural sector. But at the same time, what that does is it distracts us for some much more mundane, but I think no less or possibly more important questions, which is like, what are professional scientists working for legitimate public and private sector institutions actually doing today in their regulated laboratories? So by talking so much about bioterrorists, we forget to talk about what people, legitimate, benevolent people who are doing things for all the right reasons and want to do positive things in the world. What are they doing? And we're actually not talking about that so much. And what actually are the most likely applications to be developed by these benevolent institutions in the short to medium term? What's their purpose? In what ways do these actually address global challenges? And how does this vision of synthetic biology obscures questions about uncertainties and complexities and contingencies at the biological level as well as the social, political, and economic levels? So basically, I'm interested in all those if questions. Partly because I'm a sociologist of science, and that's what I do. I study science and scientists. But also because I think these actually are the interesting, important questions for governance. There's a lot of questions about how do you produce standardized biological parks that work like Lego. The vision of synthetic biology is we're going to have these DNA parts that just work like Lego. You can stick them in any organism and they'll always behave in the same way. Well, any synthetic biologist who works for even iGEM teams or people who work in the lab know that it doesn't work like that. It never works like that. And I mean, the people I work with at Imperial College who try to do this, if you change the medium in which you grow the same bacteria, it will behave in a different way. If you change the temperature, this is in laboratory condition, you change the temperature, it will behave differently. If you assemble the parts A, B, C, and then A, C, B, it doesn't work the same way. And we don't even know why, but we know that there are these complexities and these contingencies. And DNA doesn't work like Lego, and it's unlikely to ever work like Lego. And of course, the synthetic biologists know this, and they work with this on a day-to-day basis, and they try to find ways to overcome them, and they try to find ways to work with those uncertainties and with those contingencies and with those parameters. But then when they're talking to more policy actors or lay publics, they completely obscure those complexities and talk about DNA as if it can behave like Lego. Okay, so those if questions are absolutely fundamental. And the whole idea that synthetic biology is going to be open source and that these registries are going to be open to everybody, again, is not much more complicated than that. Or it's presented as a sort of debate between either patents or open source. And what's happening in practice is something much more entangled, where there's some open source, some patenting, and that's going to be the case. So according to our analysis, these conflicting narratives of synthetic biology, this regulatory paradox that I talked about, the speculative ethics, and in fact just the proliferation of these reports, the very phenomenon that there's so many of them, these are all social reactions, they're symptoms. They're actually a social response to what we identify as two fundamental features of synthetic biology, which are scientific uncertainty and cross-borderness. So this is where we're sort of trying to do something that's different, as I said, rather than just take these reports and summarize them, but seeing them as actually a way of understanding why is it that people are so interested in synthetic biology and the social aspects of it. And we believe it's because there's these two fundamental features. And that is, we need to speak about those more explicitly and think about the governance challenges that they present. So the first one is scientific uncertainty. And we argue that many future implications of synthetic biology are not only difficult to predict, but are fundamentally unknowable. Okay, and so we're not talking just about knowable risks that you can calculate and predict. We're talking about provisional unknowns, things that you don't know yet, or unknown unknowns, things that we don't even know that we don't know, or willful ignorance, things that we don't even bother finding out about that we could maybe find out about if we tried. I mean, we're calling all of these non-knowing, partly in reference to Ulrich Beck. And the thing about this kind of uncertainty is it's not reduced by more knowledge. In fact, in most cases, more scientific knowledge leads to more scientific uncertainty. Okay, and that's not a problem. The problem that we think is that the culture of regulation and the risk assessment methods used in the risk assessment and regulatory institutions tend to deny this kind of uncertainty or reduce it back down as much as possible, always to what can be predictable and calculable and measurable to risk. And a lot of this work is referring back to work by Andy Sterling, who's cited here, and Sheila Jasanoff, and Brian Wynne, and Ulrich Beck. So I've put this picture is actually stolen from one of Andy Sterling's latest articles published in Nature, which is entitled Keep It Complex. And his argument is that experts, scientific experts who are talking to policymakers, need to keep it complex, need to stop trying to make things simple, trying to stop denying the uncertainties and actually make those uncertainties more explicit. And I highly recommend that paper. So the second root cause for these concerns, we argue, is cross-borderness. And here we don't mean cross-borderness only mean in sort of obvious sense of crossing national and geopolitical borders, but also borders across academic disciplines and across industrial sectors. Now, of course, this isn't specific to synthetic biology. It's common to most modern science. But what we're arguing is that synthetic biology, because it explicitly aims to create synergies within and across these borders, is actually exaggerating some of the phenomena that we've seen in other emerging technologies recently. So just taking those one at a time, the The first one is crossing over disciplines. This is just one of many sort of representations of synthetic biology, but fairly typical. It's presented as being something which explicitly tries to make biology easier to engineer. So it's about applying engineering principles to biology, and it attempts to bring in lots of other disciplines such as chemistry and engineering and computing and modeling to create. And a lot of the discussion has been about the challenge of creating a cohesive, a new interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary field which will be cohesive. And how to sort of create this emerging hybrid discipline. And what we would say is these different disciplines, it's not just a question of sort of different languages and trying to get people to know how to speak together, to speak and share a language. These different disciplines actually have different epistemic cultures, different ways in which they understand what knowledge is, different ways in which they understand how you produce knowledge, how you utilize knowledge. And that's particularly true of biology and engineering, but it's also true between chemistry and biology, for example. So in terms of governance, it isn't so much about how can we reduce these language barriers, but how can we work across these barriers? How can we actually acknowledge them and recognize the difficulties that synthetic biology may encounter in operating and communicating across these scientific fields? So rather than assuming that synthetic biology is somehow going to just unify all these branches into one cohesive whole. And in the report we cite Druendi, who's one of the leading founders of the field of synthetic biology, so he's a scientist, and he says the majority of people coming into synthetic biology aren't biologists. They're physicists or computer scientists or electrical engineers, and so they're just a different culture. They don't have a lot of experience with microbiological safety. So you need to gain access or transmit knowledge across not just a generational gap, but across cultural divides. Okay? And this isn't a sociologist speaking, this is somebody who's got day-to-day experience of working in synthetic biology. So for somebody like that, the view isn't so much that synthetic biology has easily overcome disciplinary differences, but that practitioners have to work with these differences on a day-to-day level. So access to other fields can't be taken for granted, but has to be gained. And while knowledge has to be explained, communicated or translated across not just a generational gap, but across cultural divides. The other cross-borderness that we talk about is between industrial sectors, and here you have another fairly typical representation of synthetic biology, where biology is going to go through the prism of engineering principles and methods, and through that produce this lovely rainbow of different applications across a range of industrial sectors. So here we have materials, pharmaceutical drugs, biofuels, as well as some applications, in particular biosensors, which could be used in a lot of different sectors. So synthetic biology is predicted to have implications across this wide spectrum of industrial sectors, from pharmaceuticals to oil and gas corporations, chemical, industrial biotech, and food and agriculture. Now, again, in terms of governance, each of these sectors has their own dominant firms at the moment. They're overseen by different regulatory agencies. They're subject to different sets of rules, and they have different priorities and institutional cultures. But under the banner of synthetic biology, they may now be sort of summoned to the same policy table, and it might not be so easy to align the different interests and different cultures involved in these different sectors. And moreover, of course, synthetic biology is also being conducted outside of any of these traditional areas for science and technology by do-it-yourself biologists, or sometimes called garage biologists. And in a lot of the reports, there's discussion about intellectual property regimes for synthetic biology. And part of that, again, arises from the cross-borderness between disciplines, because if synthetic biology is at the confluence of biotechnology and computing, then it's argued that it neither fits into the IP regime familiar to biotech, in the biotech industry, and it doesn't fit into the copyright system regimes used in computing. And there's been a lot of discussion about how synthetic biology could overcome that. But it's the same with industrial sectors. All these different industrial sectors have different views of intellectual property rights, and it might not be so easy to align their interests. And also, the cross-borderness across countries is illustrated by the discussions on IP, because patents, although sort of the general rules are agreed on an international level. Patents are filed in different geopolitical regions, and inventors have to decide where they're going to file a patent. Since synthetic biology products are going to be invented in different countries, they're going to be used in different countries, and expected to be produced and used in different countries, it's likely to lead to uncertainties about the patentability of synthetic biology and potentially unsettling disputes. So the more traditional way of thinking of cross-border is just across national and continental borders. This is a map produced by the Woodrow Wilson Center Synthetic Biology Project here, which shows how you have, an emerging synthetic biology landscape with companies, government laboratories, research institutions, and universities working across different countries. Now, we have mostly here North America and Europe, but I don't know if you're thinking of updating this map, but certainly China should be in there, and India to some extent, and many other countries. This is obviously a few years old now. But we can see this is very typical now of most modern science. You have scientists and companies working across borders. With synthetic biology, there's a bit more to it, we'd argue. Because there's an importance of some transnational initiatives. And these are not... they're not that important in terms of the number of them or the amount of money involved, but we think that they're an interesting phenomenon that is actually having an important effect on the governance of synthetic biology. So, which means that it's not just going to be affected. So we talk a lot. We review in our report what's going on in synthetic biology in the UK, the US, and China. And obviously, in those three countries, the scientific and research culture is very different. The way in which investment works is very different. The way in which priorities are set by governments for science and research and technology is very different. But what we have is sort of another level going on, we feel, which is emerging, that leads to the importance of these transnational initiatives. We have cross-border research funding. So there's been the NSF in the US, and the equivalent in the UK has done some joint funding of projects for synthetic biology. There's been some projects funded between China and the European Commission. So the first synthetic biology project in China was actually funded by the European Commission, which is an interesting thing. I mean, obviously, within Europe, there's now a familiar framework where there's funding for different European countries to work together, either funded by the European Commission or by the European Science Foundation. But we also have the transnational administration and infrastructure of infrastructure and data, and in particular with the emerging registries and biofabs. But more importantly, perhaps, and more interestingly, there's a lot of governance propositions produced by international organizations and multinational groups. That is the familiar ones that you might have expected, like the OECD or the United Nations and the Convention on Biological Diversity and the European organizations. But what's maybe not so familiar is that we have science academies participating in these, and participating in these across borders. So there's one big initiative at the moment that they call the Six Academies Initiative, which is the engineering academies and the science academies of the US, the UK, and China, who've been conducting a number of workshops, and I believe the last one's going to be in June here in Washington. So those are the academies working together to try and make propositions for governance and trying to enroll a lot of governmental and other organizations into those initiatives. So we believe that the fuller picture of the global development of synthetic biology consists of both these national particularities, which will always be there, but also maybe these increasing entangled international relations. And we also argue here that IGEM, so the International Competition for Genetically Engineered Machines, is an unrecognized, perhaps, but body that has been very influential for the governance of synthetic biology already. And it's actually there in many ways that the culture for synthetic biology is being set, that the social engineering of synthetic biology is happening, that definitions of what counts as a good innovation is being defined, what counts as good safety is being defined, and what counts as good taking human practices, so what counts as good communication with lay publics is being defined. And this is just a bunch of undergraduate students and their tutors. But actually, and it's not the kind of place you would have gone to look for a governance body. but it has actually emerged as one of the key governance bodies for synthetic biology. It's no coincidence that the FBI sends people there and that most governments now send people there to see what's going on. So the significance of these transnational initiatives is that there's the emerging capacity to govern of some non-state actors, and that this means that nation states need to find ways to transform their authority into these transnational agents. So having identified these two key features of synthetic biology, the scientific uncertainty and cross-borderness, which, as we say, we identify these as being the key features which come out of all these other reports as being the key features of synthetic biology, which need to be addressed. We then look at what challenges those pose for governance. So the first one is that you need to govern not just knowledge, but you have to govern non-knowing. You have to govern uncertainty. You have to actually explicitly take into account non-knowing in your governance. And that, unfortunately, what tends to happen mostly at the moment is that uncertainty is excluded or denied or somehow marginalized instead governance focuses on predicting and so trying to find ways to predict what's going to happen and manage it, instead of just admitting there's some things we're not going to be able to predict and that we still have to make decisions. So it's working with uncertainty rather than denying it. So making decisions while admitting that you don't know everything and while admitting that there will always be things that you ignore, but you still have to make decisions and not pretending that you can actually predict everything in advance. The second one is the cultivation of external accountability. So because synthetic biology relies on these collaborative contributions from social groups that were previously distant to each other, so across disciplines, across industrial sectors, across geopolitical areas, there's a need to develop accountability to people outside of your own social group. So the engineers have to develop accountability from the scientists, the chemists and the biologists, the Chinese and the UK, and pharmaceutical firms and oil and gas corporations have to sit at the same table and try and develop accountability to each other, as well as to people outside of the development of synthetic biology, such as civil society groups. And so people involved in synthetic biology, they need the financial, technical, and political support from these other people that were previously outsiders. And we also stress in the report that what we mean here is not the same as just sort of incorporating external opinions into your governance or into your decision-making. But that's different from establishing external accountability. There's been a lot of talk about, especially related to sort of lay publics, of doing public engagement, opinion polls, and taking those views into account in decision-making. And there are big questions about the extent to which those views have actually been incorporated. And certainly what we could say is it hasn't been made visible, the influence or not of those views in decision-making hasn't been made visible. But even if it has had an influence, it's not the same as actually changing the power relations and making people accountable to each other. And then the third challenge we identify is the fragmentation of social authorities, which is linked to the one I just mentioned, which is that each actor can only aspire to partial legitimacy. Each can have some influence, but it will always be partial and contested and temporary. And it's in that sense that the authority is fragmented. And that leads us to our conclusions about what, and as I said, Joy called the art of governance. But I've put that I think the inverted commas got dropped because they got maybe dropped from your website. But they should be. I think it's better if they are there. I should stress. So the main thing in our recommendations or our conclusions is that we need to change the governance ethos rather than organizational design. So in contrast to a lot of reports, we actually don't have a long list of recommendations about who should do what, in a sense, or who should be the leading organization, or do we need to create a new organization who's going to take the lead in the governance of synthetic biology. And we argue more that what's important is actually just observing and monitoring and making maybe more visible and publicizing who the actors are who are participating in the governance, rather than actually trying to change the design, and also be attentive to emerging groups and bodies such as IGEM that might be completely unexpected. And secondly, we argue that the subject of governance isn't an object, but it should focus on interactions. So again, a lot of reports and a lot of discussions spend a lot of time trying to define what synthetic biology is. And I've been in many meetings where basically until we've decided we've defined what synthetic biology is, we can't talk about it. And this leads to endless discussions. Any of you who've been involved in nanotechnology have been through that too. And we say, well, instead of focusing on what the object is, because actually we don't know what it is today, and we certainly don't know what it's going to be in 10 years' time, we need to focus our governance gaze and attention to the interactions between the social actors. So we need to monitor regulatory roles of various interested parties, and then establish new international governance institutions. Okay, and then slightly more traditionally maybe, but we do also say that we need to ensure that this diversity of social actors involved or affected, we need to ensure that they can interact and express their perspectives and interests, and that these are considered in decision making, and most importantly, that their power leverage is made visible. Okay, it's not just a case of consulting with people, it's not just a case of taking on board people's perspectives and interests but not telling them that you've done it, because that actually happens as well. And also not to expect that this is going to achieve consensus or get away from controversy, or from that people do have different interests, they do have different priorities, they do have different visions, and we have to expect that, but we at least have to make it clear what decisions we're making based on which interests and which visions. And we need to explicitly acknowledge and account for non-knowing. So the aim is not to predict the unpredictable, but rather to enhance social resilience to scientific uncertainty and unpredictability. And in some more general sense, the purpose is not to prescribe how things should be, but to elicit how things could be. And I'll just leave you with this one citation by Alfred Norman, who I mentioned was the one who came up with the concept of speculative ethics, which I think really is pertinent to synthetic biology. And I'll let you read it yourselves, but my main point here is to say that maybe the governance of synthetic biology shouldn't be about governing the implications of the vision of synthetic biology. We actually need to govern and focus on what that vision is in the first place, and what it tells us about the present, not what it tells us about the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've got at least a half an hour for questions. So since we're recording this, if people could just raise their hand, we'll get you a microphone, and just tell us who you are and where you're from.
I have a question for you, Claire, about the so you integrate in your presentation and in the diagram the notion of non-knowing, and there has been a lot of work done on what's called agnotology, and so the notion of ignorance. How can we define ignorance? How can we learn from it? So I wanted to ask you, do you think there is some form of ignorance? And by ignorance I mean not knowing, but also knowing differently, so having another kind of knowledge. So is it sometimes manufactured, and what can we do about that? So manufactured by different actors, maybe by the government itself, maybe by other part of society. And how can we integrate this different way of knowing into the technology assessment, or into the debate, into the discussion? Should it be integrated at the level of governance, or at the level of producing knowledge? So maybe when the scientists are thinking about a new application in their lab, should they meet with, I don't know, people that are going to be affected in the ecosystem but by that specific application? You know well the case of the Shepherd in UK knowing about the nuclear leaks in their ecosystem. So what would you propose as a way to actually integrate that kind of epistemic order, that kind of different way of knowing, and at which level and how? Thank you.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Eleanor. But they are. Your last point was that I think most multiple ones. There are different levels and different ways of doing it, which go right from the scientist at the lab doing research which he considers can be completely basic and therefore not relevant to society, and right the way to large international governance bodies, and it is. About knowing differently, actually, is absolutely fundamental to it, and recognizing that other people know things differently, and it doesn't mean that their knowledge is less useful or less pertinent or less. And that is always a real big struggle, and that's the one. I mean, that's at the basis of all of this is the erosion of scientific authority in the last couple of decades in the Western northern world. Has happened, but hasn't quite been recognised by some of the actors, some of the scientists involved. I think don't quite. I mean, they do recognise it in the sense that they're looking for this external. That's why they keep looking for this external accountability to lay publics or to governments for creating jobs or whatever. They need to get some kind of accountability and some kind of authority, because science in itself isn't enough anymore, and yet there's constantly a return back to scientific sort of. Science-based policy is going to be the best and the only one. And how you integrate it is by having interaction by people who do know things in different ways. And synthetic biology is interesting in that sense, because the different disciplines do have... So the internal discussions between synthetic biologists coming from different disciplines, the discussions within IGEM, the discussions between the social scientists and the human practice kind of things, are fascinating and do actually show how different people know things differently and are very quite active. The problem is as soon as the communication is towards the outside, towards policymakers or towards lay publics, all of that interesting discussion is completely closed off. So when in the UK they did a public dialogue on synthetic biology, instead of having a biologist and an engineer there to talk about their different ways of knowing, they just blackboxed and had one definition of synthetic biology is this. Please tell us what you think of this. And if you went into any synthetic biology lab, that box would have been exploded in 5 minutes. So it's just it's allowing people to know differently and to discuss it in front of more open audiences as well. Yeah.
Gladys White, Georgetown University. You may have just partially answered my question. I do have one question and two comments. My question is, has there been a public consultation process in the UK about synthetic biology, as there has been concerning a whole host of reproductive technologies? My comment is that the question, what does it mean to play God, always strikes me as a very unsatisfactory placeholder for all things philosophical and ethical. And that may be no fault of yours if, in fact, your analysis of a group of reports yields that as the language holding the place for ethics and philosophy. And then my second comment is I'm intrigued by the cross-border issue related to synthetic biology, because it is very similar to what we're looking at in the area of cyber technology and cyber ethics in particular. There is no way to contain ethics related to geographical borders. So we have to reason and reflect as a world community about what is ethical or not in cyberspace. And I think it's interesting that's one aspect of ethics related to synthetic biology. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. I hope I understood your question correctly. So, public consultation in the UK. So, the UK is off, in Europe at least, I don't know how much it's come on this side of the Atlantic, put forward as the wonderful example of public consultation and public engagement on science and technology issues. And it does many of them. I am one of the people who's actually quite critical of what's going on in the UK, and I think there's other much more interesting things going on in other European countries. So there's now basically a very common model for how to do public, they call it public dialogue, you'd call it public consultation, with lay publics. organized and promoted by a semi-governmental body called ScienceWise, which, to its credit, has managed to raise the profile of public engagement and to make it something that has to be seen, has to be done and seen to be done. And that was one of its objectives, and it's succeeded in doing that. But in the process of doing that, it's introduced a particular model for how to do it, because there was a demand for having sort of off-the-shelf tools and methods to be, how can you do this? And the model that's come out are these public dialogues, which are essentially focus groups with lay members of the public who are specifically selected because for not know if they know anything about the technology, they're not allowed to come. So they're selected on socio-demographic criteria. They participate in focus groups usually 2 or 3 times over a period of a month. They get given some information or some exposure to some scientists, and in this case, social scientists. And then an independent body, or usually a market research organization, writes the report for what they said. So it resembles market research a lot more than it resembles public engagement, I would say. But it provides some intelligence, some social intelligence about what people think. And then, of course, there's a whole question of what's done with that. And the main thing which is done with that is to say we've consulted, and now we can get on with developing the technology, which is something that was said to me. And a lot of what came out of that particular one, and it's one of the reports I've got on here, I think, is consistent with what comes out of most public dialogues on new technologies, whether they're done in this context of public engagement or in the context of social science focus group research, which I've been engaged with for genetically modified crops and foods in the 1990s. It's consistently, what happens is people ask, what's the purpose? Why are you doing this? What is it going to do apart from what you say it's going to do? Are the risks and benefits going to be equitable? So, okay, we can see there's some benefits, there's some risks, but who's going to have the benefits and who's going to have the risks? And why weren't we told about this before, or why aren't people like us involved in the decision-making more? And that is very, very consistent. And this is what is on the first page of the 2-page executive summary of the report for this synthetic biology dialogue in the UK. I went around interviewing scientists after it to ask them what they'd learned from it. And what they'd seen was the half-page press release by the research councils who'd funded this dialogue, which says, report reveals public opinion on synthetic biology, and basically they like medical applications and they don't like food applications. That's the lesson that keeps being learned again and again, supposedly, by the people who are supposed to be using these results. And yet, what's coming out of these things is something I think quite different, which is consistently not seen. The most important results of this consultation is consistently sidelined and not seen and not responded to. What is the purpose? Why are you doing this? Who's going to benefit and who's going to have the risks? The playing God question, you said it was a placeholder for many other issues, and I absolutely agree with that. I wasn't sure if you meant, so again, there's often sort of statements about the public thinks that we're playing God. And in fact, again, this public dialogue and other focus group research with members of the lay public, they hardly ever use that sentence at all. Even if you take religious, we've done it, we've specifically taken religious people who go to church every Sundays, they do not use that sentence in the whole focus group. It's a sentence which is used by scientists and some ethicists when they're trying to describe what they think the public thinks. I think it doesn't actually come out of the research about publics. And it's a placeholder, and when it does, it's a placeholder for the hubris of scientists. So it's about They think they're playing God because they think that they can control everything. They think that they can create life which is going to behave in the way that they do. So it's not about whether it's new life or not. It's not about whether it's natural or unnatural. It's about the way in which the scientists are presenting themselves as gods when it does come up. Okay, off we go.
Tim?
Thanks. I'm Tim Persons. I'm the chief scientist at GAO. Thank you for your talk. It was excellent work. And I was particularly intrigued by the way you laid out the layered conditional statements in terms of if this, then that, if that, and so on. as you lead up to the whole naive or malevolent use of things. Is that a pattern beyond this conversation in synthetic biology? Is that a pattern that you're seeing across many emerging things? In other words, is that the same in nanotechnology and others? If so, where have you seen it, and what does that look like? Thank you.
Well, that's very simple. The term, as I said, actually comes from Alfred Norman, who works in the nano field. So he came up with it from his observations in nano, and the article that I cite there is about nano, and that's where he came up with it. It was very evident in nano. Forget the examples he uses, but that somehow the computers are going to work faster than our brain within 5 years, and therefore we have to talk about that. So it is a common phenomenon. And I think synthetic biology is very much a good example of it. And I've been surprised. We've had very complimentary and nice remarks on this report, by David and others from sort of kind of think tanks or researchers or people who think about these governance issues and have covered them for a long time. But I think in many other ways that this report has just sunk to the bottom of a heap because it doesn't respond to that agenda. So because we're not saying this is what you've got to do about biosecurity and this is what you've got to do about biosafety and intellectual property, some actors just don't know what to do with it because it just doesn't fit in with all the discussions that they're much more familiar with. And that is a problem. How can, if once we've recognized this kind of speculative ethics, what can we do to shift the ethos of governance?
Does the work establishing a sort of historical precedence even before nanotechnology, other nuclear science and engineering, for example, or even other emerging threat areas?
Whether it goes back that far. You've always had promises and things. There's another phenomenon which is the hype and hope cycle, and that goes back longer. This is connected with that phenomenon, but it is a bit different in the sense of taking that hype and hope and then saying we've got to discuss these, we're going to build these implications, these social implications, and then we're going to try and act on those implications.
I think this issue of the novelty trap, this issue of how we present these technologies goes way back. The idea of that, even when we saw genetic engineering, well, it's just an extension of traditional plant breeding. Nuclear reactors is just a big tea kettle boiling water. So I think that's
that's absolutely.
You see that again and again. I think it's whenever I talk to people, I remember going to meetings on nanotech, and there were people there that were much older than I was that were in the middle of the nuclear energy debates or pesticide debates, and they just kept saying it's like this. The movie, I think it was Bill Murray's movie, Groundhog Day. You feel like you just keep waking up and have to repeat the same thing over and over again.
Absolutely, no.
So the older the people are, usually the more they'll kind of validate that, gee, we had the same discussion a long time ago, and it was a little bit tweaked, but I think generally you see the same pattern and the risks and the benefits being hyped early because they're kind of inside this bubble. But I don't know if we figured. Sometimes I wonder whether socially we've learned anything because we keep repeating it. So.
I agree that's absolutely true, and that's not new, and it makes me feel old. But I was there for the whole GM food crops debate, and it just really is. I just think this is so familiar. and the thing is, it's not the same people because there are these engineers who've come in. So it's not the same people who've been involved in the GM controversy. So they're just completely reinventing it, and not aware of what happened, or they have their own interpretation of what happened with GM crops, which is that the public was stupid, and that's what the problem was. Nothing else was wrong. So that's the only interpretation they have of the GM controversy. And they're completely repeating. The genetic killer switches, which we had. We've had those. Thank you. we know, is one example. But the speculative ethic, I think, is a bit different because there's now what might not have been present before is this idea that we need to think about the implications and predict them and do something about those bad implications in advance. And how can we do that? And therefore it leads to all this sort of work on what the implications are going to be and the ethics of it and how we can do it. Sorry, yes.
JD?
J.D. Hansen from the International Center for Technology Assessment. I'm one of the people that helped coordinate the principles for the oversight of synthetic biology. That's not what I'm asking a question about, though. I think there's another aspect of Groundhog's Day, and that is that the that at least in the U.S., I won't speak for the U.K. Because I haven't looked at the U.K. situation as much. At least in the U.S., different parts of government haven't learned from what we've done before with other technologies. For example, when we did the Human Genome Project, they set aside 3%, which is a fairly piddling amount, for ethical, legal, social implications. Here we're dealing with a technology that also has all these environmental implications, so we should probably set aside even more to look at those issues. One of the big funders of this technology, outside of Exxon and Chevron and those oil companies, is the National Science Foundation. And so when I looked at the National Science Foundation's figures, and I looked for every project they'd ever funded that had the term synthetic biology in it, there were like 685 projects. And then looked for how many that looked at environment and governance. There were 12, by the way, David, you're one of those researchers, one of those 12. So, how do we, how do we get the government agencies that are funding this stuff to look at these other aspects, and then, how do we get them to be transparent about what they're doing? I've been trying to get from the Department of Energy more information about what they've funded and what stipulations they put on things, and I get back lots of black sheets of paper which say confidential business information, we can't disclose this to you. But they're funding it, and we're funding it. So, if the public is going to fund all this, what more should we ask of the funding agencies?
Yeah, I don't know how much that's a question that I can respond to, but I can. There's two things. One, transparency in public funding is crucial, and private sector as well would be. But starting off with public sector funding, it's incredible how difficult it is to find out what public sector funding is going on sometimes in certain fields. And then, of course, as soon as it's private sector, it's even harder. This idea that we need a certain percentage of the money going into LC or ethics or whatever, I think is a useful way of thinking about it. There's a lot of criticism in my field about how that 3% of the in the Genome Project was spent, and in a sense, and it goes back a bit to my speculative ethics points. It's a lot of that fell in that kind of category of, let's take for granted that the genome is going to be the book of life that's going to tell us how to do all these wonderful things and think about those implications. Well, and in the end, the Genome Project didn't deliver those things. It's delivered a lot of other things, but that have been ignored because we were so focused on looking at these particular promises that were made. The Centre for Synthetic Biology and Innovation that I'm a part of, 20% of the initial budget went to us, as it were. So that's partly why I went for the job. I thought that's the first time I've seen such a big percentage of the money. Of course, overall, that still leaves a question of what do we do once we're working together in a partnership like this. And this is something we've been thinking a lot about. And within the UK, there's quite a large group of social scientists and ethicists that have been enrolled into working with synthetic biologists. And part of it is thinking about what we're not allowed to look at where the private sector investment is going because it's confidential. We're not allowed to talk about risks because that's making it look too scary. We're only really supposed to be talking about bioterrorists and these speculative issues. That's it's much harder to try and talk about what's actually going on day to day in the lab. I'm a member of the Imperial Centre, so I can go there whenever I want. But whenever I go, I go and walk around the labs and ask people what they're doing. They're very polite and they're very nice. There's absolutely no opposition to what I'm doing. But it's like, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be out there talking to the United Nations or whoever else? Why are you interested in what I'm doing? And why should I talk to you? I will talk to you because they're perfectly polite and nice, but they just don't understand that why we might be interested, and that's the real challenge, which we're working on, but it's hard work.
I think the other issue is whether the LC model works here. I mean, so what certainly, when we moved it into nanotech, and also I think with synthetic biology, environmental issues were orphaned. There was no real place for them in ELSI. I mean, the Canadians came up with something called E-Cube ELSI, which is environment, ethics, economics, legal, social. Which is, I think, much more holistic. I mean, the problem we had with nano, if you remember, was that 5 years after we started the National Nanotech Initiative, we sort of ran into, wow, there are some pretty significant environmental issues. And at that point in time, the National Science Foundation invested $24 million to set up the Center for the Environmental Implications of Nano, but that was a big lag. And I think the same issue happens with synthetic biology. It's sort of, there's nowhere for the environmental issues to sit. So immediately we put, we focus on the ethical issues and then some of the social issues, but I think the environmental work has become orphaned. I don't know how it is in the UK.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, there's also just the acronym. I mean, the whole concept, the problem with the LC model is this idea that scientists can be on one side and the LC can be, even if it's funded alongside, but it's alongside, it's downstream, it's implications of. And it's even just having an acronym. If you ask most people what LC means, they don't know. They don't even know what So, and if they say anything, they'll say ethics. So I'm constantly presented as the person who does the ethics, and I constantly have to say, no, I do not do ethics. I'm a sociologist. I study scientists. And then when the ethics means, this is over. I go to a lot of scientific conferences and present so you look at what the public thinks. So that's what LC means for a lot of people. It's just like playing God and what the public thinks, not serious environmental questions, not what the scientists are doing, not where the money is going, not where the actual vision of synthetic biology is. So there's a real issue of what. And I mean, the Simberg experience in the US of social human scientists trying to do something different has been interesting and unfortunate in many ways, because I think they really were trying to show that there was a different way of doing it, what they were calling a post-LC model, doing something different. And the fact that has failed in rather spectacular ways is unfortunate for many of us, because again, the interpretation of that failure can multiple, but it does mean that a lot of people have had their fingers burnt and think, oh well, we can't work with those guys anyway. So,
other questions? Let me ask you one question, because I mean, you were talking a little bit about the impact of the report, and I mean, for us, I think it was one of the things that we're very interested in is emergent organizations, a lot of the interactions that you were talking about. But on the other hand, I can think of a lot of people who would look at this report and say, I'm not, as an institution, I'm not in it. And so, what is it? What do I do? Right. And whether that's been an issue in terms of just getting traction, because I think the basic premise of the report is very important, and it was very different from a lot of the other reports, but I can see why it was difficult quite often to find an audience for it.
Yeah. No, I think that's maybe true, and maybe we didn't... The language of it and the length of it and the fact, that it is difficult for it to have traction among certain people. And I mean, we explicitly avoid trying to say this is a list of important institutions and this is what they should do. But by doing that, as you say, that means that a lot of people don't know where they fit in at all. And maybe there's a way of trying to bridge that gap and make it more clear. And I think, and also because it doesn't, and partly because there's a lot of other reports out there. And as I said, most people don't read any of the reports. It's just the fact that they exist. But I think, again, because it doesn't engage in the same way, and it's cross purposes, is another reason why it didn't have much traction. It's being it is being used in the UK. There's at the moment there's a roadmap exercise, and this has been one of the on the reading list, for all the participants. I also work quite a bit in France. I used to live and work in France, and I'm still involved in work there. And I did another report for the French Ministry of Research, and that was more specific. They wanted recommendations for how to do dialogues with society. So it's not the same kind of recommendations, but it did end up talking about how you want to have a body that would actually just observe who the actors are and arrange for interactions between them, and not try and govern sort of direct where it's going, but actually just observe it. And to my slight surprise, when the ministry had started off saying, "Tell us how to do a good opinion poll or how to do a UK-based, model for public dialogue," took on board all of our recommendation. It has set up something which they're calling the observatory, which has got firms, it's got the ministers, it's got some social science. I sit on it as a social scientist. It's got NGO, it's got civil society, critical civil society groups sitting on it. And its aim is just initially to map and observe, and it's specifically one of our recommendations is do not try and define synthetic biology before you start, just work with it. And we had a first meeting, of course, a couple of weeks ago, and some of the people who were invited did go back to this question: how can we talk about anything if we haven't defined it yet? And how are we going to possibly know what we're observing? And why should we just be observing and not intervening? But of course, by observing and by creating those interactions, of course, you do intervene and you do create things. So that's been a very positive experience, which isn't directly out of this report, but out of our general approach. And it will be interesting to see what happens.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
Yeah, my name is Bumia Menanja. I am a research assistant with the STEP program. And you mentioned, you highlighted the challenge with synthetic biology, especially because of the cross-borderness of having biologists and engineers working together. And I was wondering if in your research, if there's any evidence of researchers from both disciplines actually coming together and producing specific recommendations on how to address these issues. I know, for example, in intellectual property, you have suggestions floated around of some sort of hybrid system where you can have open source and the patent system on copyright coming together and being a good suggestion for regulating the intellectual property rights. Is there any evidence of something similar like that in addressing the ethical issues and some of the other issues in SynBio?
So that's coming from the disciplines themselves.
Like just
how they
exactly.
Because I would say, let's just talk about the discussions are much more about how can we create a new generation of scientists who won't be engineers or biologists, they'll be synthetic biologists. So Imperial College has an undergraduate course and a master's course in synthetic biology, trying to somehow create this new breed. But in the meantime, there's a recognition that the older ones are all have their own parent disciplines that they will belong to. So the discourse tends to be more about how can we create this new unified discipline rather than recognizing that they need to actually work across those borders. And to some extent, I'd be interested to know what you're thinking of in terms of these models for hybrid regimes in intellectual property, because a lot of the debate is like either we have to have patents or we have to have open source, and very idealized versions of those two are presented and put in contrast to each other. And what's going on is, of course, much more messy. So I haven't actually seen that many sort of formal recommendations for something that would be a hybrid model and how that would work. I've seen some, but they're not very fully worked through.
Right.
There's an idea that they should be, but...
Okay. Well, we thank you for coming and sharing the report. The video should be up in probably a few days. Claire's slides are up on the website, so we can download those, right?
Yeah.
Share them. Okay. And there's some copies of the report out there also that's available. We should have a link on it. Thank you.